Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. This is a little fill-in video on the grounds that when I announced I was going to do the live broadcast, which in fact was a miserable failure, but nonetheless when I announced it, I asked people to leave requests for a look at certain plants. Some people left a request to look at virtually the whole collection. Not very practical, but individual plants I was prepared to sort of make sure they were out and ready to go. But as the live broadcast had half the screen cut off, some of those plants didn't really get looked at very well, shall we say. That's the polite version. But anyway, this was one of them, and this one never gets filmed. Never gets filmed because it hasn't done much for some considerable time. This is Encyclia cordigera, but it's actually a named variety. It is Siang Yu, which just means that, you know, the cross was redone. Seed was produced. It's a flipping species, idiot. Come on, get a grip. Even though it is early in the day. And obviously when you produce plants from seed, there is a natural variety that occurs. And sometimes the variety is special, and a particular plant from that batch of seedlings will be special, and it's good enough to actually be given a name and get registered as a, you know, as a named variety. That's how these things occur a lot of the time. Sometimes it's because they get awarded by the American Orchid Society or RHS or somebody like that, which allows you to then name the thing. You know, you can have your own name on it if you like. But anyway, so this was a named variety. But like some of the orchids I've had for some time, it has a story. There used to be a really good grower who originated from Thailand, and basically she was a fantastic character around the shows. A tiny little lady, probably weighed about 4 stone soaking wet, but her speciality was really cattleyas, and they were direct imports, which she then, you know, looked after in the UK and took round to the shows, and probably ventured out into some of the other European shows as well, called Chantel. And basically her other half got offered really good work out in Australia. And obviously a debate ensued about what happens with the orchid business and that. And she said, I've been doing it a long time, and quite honestly it's getting more difficult as that time progresses. The restrictions on the imports and various reasons like that. But apart from that, this country wasn't doing her health any good. So she just jumped at it. So her whole business was just closed down, and off she went to Australia to sunnier, warmer climes, which she said was going to suit her health a lot more. But I'd known her for years, and before she left I thought, well, there's no way she's getting off to Australia without me having a Chantel plant. And as she really specialised in cattleyas, I chose a nice cattleya, which I've still got. In fact, it will be blooming soon. And then I looked around, and she had this Encyclia cordigera sat there in amongst the, what I call the also-rans. There's a big massive display of all their spectacular cattleyas, and round the corner on the end was some other plants. And this was one of them. But it was coming into bloom, and it looked a fantastic plant, so I thought, well, I'll have that as well, as an additional memory of Chantel. So I did, and I bought it. And when I got it home, it was incredibly root bound, and it was very difficult to keep hydrated. It was just a pot full of solid roots, basically, and quite a small pot for the size of the plant. So I did something I hadn't done before, and I potted it on, not really thinking ahead for any length of time, basically. So I just put it in a quite, you know, a bigger pot with some fresh media around the outside. And it sort of worked, because quite a few of the new roots went down into that new media. But there came a time when it still needed to be repotted. And at that time, when I took it out of the pot and had a good look at it, all of the old root system had died and rotted away. So obviously that pot full of roots was in broken down media, which is a bit naughty. That's probably how it was imported, come to think of it. But nonetheless, I'd lost the majority of the root system and had to try and recover it. And it took a long time to get going again. And I mean a long time as well. Well, it has now got going, complete with its companion plant, its little fern, which I can't get out. I'll have to wait till I repot it again to get that fern out. It has to come out, though. I don't want to leave it in there. It'll do much better in its own little pot, down with the other little collection of ferns. So anyway, this is the plant. That's how I came to get it and what happened to it in its immediate future. Now, what I've got on here are maturing new growths. They haven't fully matured yet. Obviously it has bloomed, and since I got it from Chantel, that flush of blooms, it did actually bloom once more after that, but it now hasn't bloomed for some time. But during the last growing season it did put up quite a few new growths that are now maturing. Now, under normal circumstances, this has a pair of leaves at the top, yeah, and one, sometimes two from the base, but mainly a pair of leaves at the top. This new growth over here has only got one leaf instead of two. Now, that may be the stump of the second leaf. It may also be a spike, just in its infancy. And some of the new growths came up in the middle of the plant. Those two there, they're maturing. No sign of sheaths on much of this plant at the moment. This is a new growth out the side, I think, from memory. But that's its state of play at the moment. It will be due a repot sometime, but not yet. It's grown quite a few roots since it was potted up, and it has got quite a few aerial roots as well. So, I mean, as a plant, it's doing okay. And I'm pretty confident that some of these new growths are going to bloom, but there's no real strong signs of blooming yet. But anyway, I mean, it's a nice plant. It's now growing okay, nice big fat bulbs and everything, but it does produce new growths in some strange places. It's you know, as I said, there's several of the new growths have just come straight up in the middle of the plant, so it's like climbing upwards. You know, there's all three of these growths here are sat up the top of the plant, but they still push their roots down in between the bulbs and still get some of their roots down into the media, so I'm not particularly worried about its growth pattern. So that's that one. Sorry, Martin, forgotten twice that one, but done now. That's that one. And the other one I completely forgot, which I shouldn't have done because it was easily accessible, is this thing. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be keeping this because it's a dendrochilum and they don't appeal to me that much. I can't even put my finger on it why. But what this did, I mean, it was a tiny little young plant when I got it, is it pushed out a lead up this end and another one up this end, but they were inferior. They didn't grow to their full size. I must admit, it didn't have very good roots on it. Since then, it's produced this new growth, which is producing some new roots. But this lead seems to have stalled now, so it's only growing in one direction. Pretty cool growers, dendrochilums. So it's sort of, its general life is down in with the cooler growers, the Masdevallias and Restrepias and things like that. And it's sort of okay, but the blooms don't appeal to me. I don't know, you can't like all orchids. We all have our own individual tastes, and this one doesn't appeal to me that much. But it does have a new growth, it does have some roots, and I'm sure somebody would think it's absolutely wonderful. It's what I call a rat's tail bloom. In other words, it has very long arching blooms with loads of individual blooms on, sometimes hundreds, and some of them are minuscule. You know, you really do need a magnifying glass to even get a glimpse of what the blooms look like. And they're stunning. If you can get some real macro photography going, the individual blooms are smashing. But under normal circumstances, most of them are so tiny as to not... They're more of a spectacle when you get a nice specimen plant with lots and lots of lovely arching blooms coming off in all directions. And they do look stunning. From a distance, they look stunning. But then if you think, oh, I wonder what the actual blooms are like, and you try and get in close and see the actual blooms, the individual blooms, and they are often really tiny. Now, the individual blooms on this one are not some of the tiniest by any means. They are visible, they're not too bad. But it doesn't appeal to me, I'm afraid. The whole genus doesn't appeal to me. I've only got the one. I think it may have been in the big box. But it's certainly not one I would have bought, so obviously was a gift at some point. And I tend to try and keep gifts on the grounds that if somebody's gone to the trouble of giving me an orchid, the least I can do is sort of try and grow it well. But I'm probably never going to grow this one that well. I mean, it's strange. A lot of people think, you know, the cooler growers, the Masdevallias and things like that, are potted orchids. Well, quite honestly, if it's an epiphyte, it can be mounted. It's just, you know, the workload involved, and often people have got mounts, like me, hanging up high. Yeah, a lot of my mounts are up here. Yeah, well, those are the warmer areas and highlight areas. So if I mounted a Masdevallia, that would be the wrong place to keep it, even though it might grow well on the mount. And to start having mounts hanging on these lower racks is just going to be a major inconvenience, because they'd have to be moved every time I want to get at the plants. So even though I'm sure they would grow well mounted, they wouldn't work in here for practical reasons, not for any other reason. I'm sure they'd still grow well. Anyway, those were the two sort of missed out ones, and that's just filling in a gap. They were specifically asked for, and they either got shown in the live broadcast, but we couldn't see them because, as I said, the bottom third and the right hand side of the screen were just chopped off due to a settings intervention, I'll call it. Stick with a polite version, Roger. So that's just filling in the gap. Watering all the ordinary pots today, so it's my big watering day. This is my hardest workload, because I always try and do them all in one go. But Holy clay pots have already been done. Mounts don't need doing. Vandered bucket doesn't need touching today. And the cooler, shadier lot got done. So all I'm doing is what I call the ordinary pots. And I suspect when I come to water some of those, they won't need watering. They'll still be damp. And at this time of year, with these low temperatures, as far as I'm concerned, the Oncidium Alliance, the types of plants I've got in ordinary pots, they can go dry in between watering. It's not going to hurt them. It's better that than keeping them too wet and watering them simply for a practical reason, because they're not going to get looked at again for probably another week. Well, if I miss a run, they're going to go like 2 weeks without any water. I'd rather do that than get them too wet at the end of the first week, if you see what I mean. So I won't water a plant unless it's dry, and then it'll get a good soak. So that's how I'm working at this time of year. But it's going to change. You know, we're heading towards February, and as February progresses, daytime temperatures will get a bit better. Actual true daylight will get that bit longer, starting earlier in the day, and things will start to move. And once we get out into March, things will really start to move. And at that point, it will be very rare to miss a plant out on a watering run, because they'll be coming back into growth. We did have a very cold night last night. The frost is still up on the shed. Loads of igloos out in the road that used to be cars. I don't know what we actually got down to last night. So that's the high since I last reset it, 26.5 degrees C. We actually got down to just over 11 degrees, and that probably was last night. It was a very cold night last night. So now my heater is set to 12. Yeah, so in theory it should never drop below 12, but it can. It can drop down at such a rate that it's continuing to drop for a little bit after the heater kicks in. I mean, you know, this isn't a hugely powerful heater. It takes a couple of minutes. So it comes on, the big fan comes on with it to distribute that heat and not get any hot spots and frazzle any plants in the line of fire. And it takes about 2 minutes to get it back up to the cut-off setting. which is in fact 13.5. I do a 1.5 degree differential on that thermostat. And what actually happens is at the point that the heater cuts off at 13.5, it carries on getting a bit warmer for a while and gets up to about 14. And then, as I said, it starts to drop down. And sometimes it will continue to drop a bit even though the heater's come on, because it takes a while. It takes a while for that heat to distribute. Anyway, that's just catching up on those two plants. We'll have a quick look at this one. This is opened up a little bit more. This is the Dendrobium Cuthbertsonii, first ever bloom for me. And this little plant seems to be growing a bit now, slowly but surely. I was going to say, we wait for the better weather and it should kick on a bit, but the better weather may stall it. This is a real cool grower, this one. It's one of the few dendrobiums that can be found in the montane forests, so cool and very humid. And according to what I've read, it's never ever been found except on mossy branches. It only ever seems to grow where there is a moss covering on the branch. It's never found on bare branches. So I've read. I mean, I haven't been there and checked. Which is why I potted it, or planted it up in this manner, so that it's got that moss. Yeah. Now that may be one of those associations that you get in the plant world where the plant roots have an association with certain types of moss. And it's needed. I don't know that. It's just a possible guess. But anyway, we have a bloom on it. I don't know whether it's going to be a colour changer or not, but it's a nice bronzy colour, and bloom size to plant, very good. So looking nice. The Tolumnia that's been out for ages. These are branches off the original spike. It does actually have another spike starting on the latest growth. So these are starting to get that faded look now, so they won't be with us too much longer. But then we've got another spike coming on behind. And quite honestly, out of the Tolumnias I've got, I think there's only 2 that haven't got a spike on at the moment. They're all at it. Some of them have got multiple spikes. So we're going to have Tolumnia blooms down the line quite soon. The other thing I wanted to say is my project plants, obviously I don't want to film the same plants too often, but I do want to do regular updates. And I had a look back yesterday at when the original videos were produced, and the first one went out, I think it was around the 13th of December, and then there were actually 5 videos. There was a part 1A and B, and then a part 2, 3 and 4, and they all went out during that sort of December period. So I'm looking at revisiting those end of January, beginning of February, and the idea will be that I will keep the plants in the same parts as they were before. So the only difference will be instead of having a part 1A and B, that will just be part 1. So there'll only be 3 videos next time, 1, 2 and 1, 2 and, oh no, there'll still be 4. But the same plants will be in the same part numbers. So all the plants that were in part 1 and A and B will be in part 1 in the same order. And we'll be looking at what they looked like in the previous video and then what they look like currently. That's the idea of doing a progress report on a set number of plants. So I'll be thinking about doing that probably towards the end of next week. The end of this week has got 2 Orchid Society meetings. It's just the way it's gone, and it'll only happen in January. I've got my normal Bournemouth Orchid Society the last Friday of the month, so that'll be this Friday evening. But the Wessex normally meet on the 2nd Saturday afternoon of the month. But unfortunately in January, the hall that they use has got a pantomime running, so they couldn't get in there at the normal time. So it's the first Saturday they could get, and it just happens to be 2 consecutive days. So, yeah. If there's interesting plants there, I'll film the competition benches, as usual, if I can. And we'll go from there. That could make 2 nice little interesting videos of other people's orchids instead of just looking at mine all the time. So I'll see what I can do. And I must admit, every time I come in here, that splash of purple speckles really does catch my eye. And several people said And I thought, well, I'll wait and see. When these open, they are a deep colour, and then they fade. And quite honestly, they're looking better now than they have done, because they've got a much more subtle colour, and the spots show up so much better. So that's BC Mackay, but it's not called that anymore because it's a Brassivola crossed with a Cattleya, but the Cattleya has been reclassified. It's not a Cattleya anymore, so it's actually got a new intergeneric name. But at the moment I can't be bothered to memorise it. So in here it's still BC Mackay, but lovely blooms. I'm well impressed, and that's a very lightweight blooming for this particular plant, but it's its first time it's bloomed for me, so I'm pleased. But I've got 4 blooms on one spike and 2 on another. And it's put on quite a show. But I think next time it blooms in the middle of winter, you know, we could end up with 5 or 6 spikes, all with 4 or 5 blooms on. So don't hold your breath, it's a year away, but I think next time that blooms, that should be quite a spectacle. But nonetheless, it's looking good now. Okay, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by, and sorry I missed your plants out, you guys, but it's done now.